So what I'm going to focus my presentation on is the role of the solicitor when it comes to a civil claim following a road traffic incident in particular and complex injury such as an amputation, and really focus on the benefits of collaborative working. So I've got a couple of case studies I'll look at as well. In terms of who we are as a firm, so the name of the firm is Road Traffic Accident Law Scotland, and we trade under three names, so Motorcycle Law, Cycle Law and Pedestrian Law Scotland. So we represent all vulnerable road users. And the nature of that means that we do tend to see a lot of complex injury cases because unlike car drivers, vulnerable road users have no protection. So when they are involved in a collision on the street, on the roads, they do tend to suffer potentially catastrophic and life-altering injuries. So that's kind of where we focus. Our USP, as it were, is everyone within our team is a cyclist and or motorcyclist. So we understand the vulnerability that our clients feel out on the roads, but also we understand the importance that motorcycling and cycling plays in our clients' life. And majority of them just want to get back to that, regardless of how severe their injury is. So we want to work with them and with the experts to make sure that's possible. And that often involves adaptations to prosthetics or adaptations to the motorcycle to make sure that they can return to their passion, because it is a way of life for a lot of our clients. So we are very keen to be involved in that in terms of the rehabilitation. It all starts from the first meeting you have with your client. So for us, that would be going to see them in hospital or at home and understanding who they are and what their injuries are. So what the impact of those injuries are going to be for them. As part of that, we also need to understand their support network. So who do they have once they get discharged home? Do they have a partner? Do they have children at home? Do they have parents that are going to be assisting? Or potentially do they live alone? Because at that stage, we might need to make sure a case manager is involved early on because there might need to be professional care on discharge. So we need to understand that. We can't look at it in isolation of the client. We also need to have frank discussions about liability, potentially at early stages. So understanding, does our client remember the incident and what input can they give us in terms of their evidence? Are there witnesses we can speak to early on? Because we need to manage their expectations. There's no point in promising your client the earth if you can't then deliver. In terms of statements that we take as lawyers, they are really the foundation to your entire case, and they will frame how you progress with your case. They'll frame what experts you instruct, how you instruct them, and also when it comes to litigation, how you form your litigation as well. So any material change or update with your client should be noted in a statement. As well as taking statements from your client, services statements are fundamental in amputee and catastrophic injury cases, because as I mentioned previously, you need to understand the family dynamic. So if there are young children that your client has to care for as a parent, then how is that going to work for them as an amputee? But also there are little bits of information you can get from loved ones that you'll never get from your client. No matter how open and honest you think they might be, some people can brush off and say, you know what, I'm fine, I'm getting on with life, there's no problem. And if you take that at face value, you will miss out in a huge aspect of the claim. Often it's the psychological impact of a life-altering injury that you will only find out about once you speak to the spouse or the best friend or whoever it might be. It can also be important to take statements from clinicians. As we've heard from David and from Helen, what's available on the NHS and what's available privately differs quite dramatically. So speak to the clinicians, find out what is available for the NHS for your particular client, and also what timeframes are going to be involved. But also it's important to speak with employers as well. Following an amputation, your client may never be able to return to employment, but there are cases where they could return to the same employment or an altered version of that. So find out early on from their employer, is that going to be possible? And what adaptations would need to be done in the workplace for that to happen? In complex cases, you'll have a whole number of reports that you then provide to the defender for them to then effectively value the case and put forward an offer. But defender solicitors and insurers will never have the benefit of actually meeting your client and understanding who they are as a person. So what can be really, really helpful is a day in the life of video. Understanding the impact an amputation has on your client and their family dynamic, their work dynamic, their social life, etc. And that can give a little glimpse into the highs and lows of their life. It's all well and good saying, you know, we've got them a microprocessing limb, they can return to effectively close to near normal life. But that isn't the realization for majority of amputees. They will have time spent in a wheelchair, or they have sores on their stump, and therefore this needs to be shown and can be shown extremely well in a video so that all parties can understand the impact. In terms of equipment and adaptations, for the purpose of this, we're obviously focusing on prosthetics. But in order for you to, as a solicitor, to instruct the prosthetist and tell them what it is you want from them, you need to understand who your client is and what their hobbies are. Have those hobbies and goals changed pre-incident to them now being an amputee? And are they all achievable? You might not know the answer to that, but you can speak with the likes of David and say, look, my client wants to get back to mountain biking. How can we make sure that that prosthetic is suitable for them and will allow them to do that? Equally, they might want to start rock climbing, or you name it. The world may well be their oyster, but you need to understand who to ask and how to get that information across. If input is needed, then obviously speak with the prosthetist, the physiotherapist, to make sure that your client's expectations again are met with regards to their goals. Before and after statements are key here, because at the end of the day, the purpose of a civil claim is to put your client back in the position had the incident never occurred. And that is only possible if you know what they were like pre-incident. Majority, if not all your clients, the likelihood is you will never have met them pre-incident. So you don't know who they are until you find out. And it's a matter of speaking to their best friend, speaking to their fellow colleagues, whatever it might be, but find out who they are. How sociable were they? Because again, in taking these statements, sometimes you'll find out that even though your client says they're coping, they're turning down every invitation to go anywhere because they just don't want to face the outside world. You only find that out once you start speaking to people. Have their injuries changed their outlook? Some people become more upbeat, thinking, right, I've just dodged death effectively. I'm now going to look at my life differently. Other people can become a shell of themselves. So you need to understand who they were. They might be quiet and timid, but they might always have been quiet and timid. And this is another situation where you can use video footage, before and after videos. The interesting thing here is nowadays, social media, so many people upload snippets of their life. So is there footage of them pre-incident or pictures of them pre-incident that you can demonstrate who they were, so that you can then support why a particular prosthetic arrangement is important to that client? Because in showing that, you can then build the picture that can be used to present to the defender and potentially the court as well. It helps you to understand the impact the injury has had on the client, and then that means you can best present that case to the defenders and the court in due course. It's key as the solicitor to keep up to date and know the options in the NHS and privately, but also the difference between Scotland and England. I know David spoke at the start of his presentation about the availability in Scotland by comparison to elsewhere in the UK. I have to say my experience is obviously far more limited in respect of amputees by comparison to David, but the interesting thing I've seen, we've had a client who had his motorcycling incident in Scotland, but he resides in England, so had all his NHS treatment down there. He was discharged home as a below knee amputee, no prosthetic, in a wheelchair, and remained like that effectively for 18 months until we were able to get PACE involved. The flip side of that is we have clients in Scotland who are discharged with limbs, but they're not always suitable for what they want to be able to achieve. And sometimes they lose confidence in being able to use that limb or any limb. So you've then got to work backwards and get early intervention so that they feel comfortable and confident moving forward. So it is important to know, once you understand who your client is the NHS limb they've been provided with going to allow them to get back to the life that they want to lead? But also know what is available privately, because it isn't a one size fits all. And that certainly isn't, from my experience, PACE's attitude either. They look at the individual and what is suitable for them. When you are instructing an expert such as a prosthetist, it may well be that the joint instruction of a non-contentious expert should be done. And it's communication with your opposite number. At the end of the day, if you have an amputee, you're most likely going to need a prosthetic report. And that shouldn't be a contentious issue. So if you can do a joint instruction, you reduce down the costs for both parties. But it also potentially allows you early intervention. And early intervention, we can see that we can see that there's rehab benefits, there's financial benefits, again, to both parties, and money talks when it comes to insurance companies. But there's also psychological benefits. If you can get someone back up, walking, running, cycling, whatever it might be that drives them, then potentially they can return to the employment market far earlier. And that helps them build up the life that they had pre-incident as well. So it really can't be overstated how important early intervention can be for rehab generally, but also prognosis longer term. The key here is collaborative working. Then there is this attitude, and I know Toby touched on it, that what happens north of the border is we have this them and us mentality of, well, we represent the client, the other side represent the insurer, and we're just not going to speak until it comes to talking about money later on in the case. But that does not help your client. And as a pursuer solicitor, the client is at the center of everything you do. So you need to be able to work collaboratively with your opposite number, especially if liability is admitted early on. There is no reason to hold on to your reports and not discuss matters because you are doing your client a disservice. See if you can get interim payments early on to pay for private provision of prosthetics, rehabilitation, or get direct funding in place so that head of claim is covered and has been agreed. It is far easier convincing a court that a prosthetic arrangement is suitable if it's been purchased or at the very least has been tested by that pursuer. It has financial and time savings because the client is then up using that limb, and also there are the financial setbacks in terms of if they can go back to work earlier, all that type of stuff. So it's about, again, knowing who your client is and expressing that to the defender so that you can make sure you can work together. Of course, that isn't always going to be the case. You'll have a number of cases where liability is in dispute and collaborative working is going to be limited. There may well be a high degree of contributory negligence, for instance, and therefore getting funding in place for the prosthetic is going to be difficult as well. But at the very least, make sure your client has tested the recommended limb by the prosthetic expert. I'm not going to look too much into the actual law side of things and case law, because that's something that Steve loves going to talk about, but just briefly touch on the case of Adam Wagner against Thomas Grant and another, because this was actually a case of ours. And the key takeaway from that is the importance of testing the recommended limb. If you have a client who says, this is the limb I want and this is the limb I will purchase upon conclusion of my claim, I've tried it, it's fantastic, it allows me to do everything I want to do, a court is going to find it very difficult to turn and go, you're not getting it. As David has shown in his presentation, video footage of what the difference is between the NHS provision and the private arrangement can be key here. And also relate it back to what it is your client wants to achieve. Is there a reason they need a microprocessing limb? Is there a reason in terms of their age, their activity, etc.? In order to understand that, you need to work with the entire team that is working with your client. So speak with the occupational therapist, the physio, the case managers, the prosthetists, understand what their role is and where the crossover is. Because once you understand that, you can then speak with your opposite number and explain why there's all this there is the various input, explain why you need reports from all these people, why you potentially need statements from all these people. Because if you understand the process, you can then far better present your case. A team approach is always going to be key. I've got two brief case studies just showing the benefit of early rehabilitation. So the first, it's a 19-year-old male. He's an above-knee amputee following a motorcycling incident. He lives in rural Aberdeenshire and has quite big aspirations for what he wants to achieve. When I met him in hospital post-amputation, his life had ended. He did not think he was going to be able to do anything. He was going to be confined to a wheelchair, live with his parents for the rest of his life. That was it. It was over. He then decided all these things that he wanted to do pre-incident that he now couldn't do. So I needed to understand who he was, what was his personality, what drove him, and also understand what was available in the NHS. he had been at Aberdeen Royal Infirmary for a substantial period before moving on to Woodhouse Hospital. And it's meant to be part of a rehab centre, but in all honesty, he brought down the average age in that hospital by about 50 years. He could not cope with the situation he was in. He disengaged entirely from rehab. Also, I think the rehab disengaged from him. They couldn't understand what it is he wanted to achieve because they weren't used to individuals like him. And it meant that he had become even more depressed and more withdrawn. So collaborative working with the insurers, we got early funding in place in order for PACE to carry out a report and then in turn buy the Genium X3 for this gentleman and get him engaged with rehabilitation. Given where he lived, he felt very isolated, and that then had a knock-on impact for the psychological trauma as well. Unfortunately, during all this time, COVID hit, which meant that he did become slightly more withdrawn. But the fantastic thing of having PACE involved here was it built his confidence in what he could do. Louise was the physiotherapist here, and she got him out doing various activities to show what was possible with his limb. So while he couldn't get out on his motorcycle straight away, she did get him back on two wheels, maybe not quite the same adrenaline rush that he was used to, but he was out on an e-bike, and there's a very brief video here. It may not look like anything special, but just weeks before this, he was in a wheelchair, not using the prosthetic limb that he'd been discharged with the NHS with, and it's effectively, the transition is really quite remarkable. So the second case study I have here is a 68-year-old female, also above knee amputee. She had been a pillion passenger on her husband's motorcycle, and he was significantly injured in the incident. It was a head-on collision. She wanted to be able to return to gardening, but also help care for her husband. The NHS provision here did not take into account her petite frame nor her other injuries. So initially, they looked at providing her with a prosthetic where in order for it to be fitted, there was a belt that went up and over her shoulder, but she'd fractured her shoulder, so that didn't suit. They then used another type of belt that went around her pelvic area. But when I went to see her in hospital, the size of her prosthetic limb was about double the size of her own leg. She struggled with the weight of it, she'd lost all confidence in walking, and she used her wheelchair to get around. She did not want to be apart from her husband, but while he was in a rehab facility down south, we engaged with PACE because at that point they hadn't yet moved into Scotland. And so we were able to get her assessed. It was the Knievel microprocessing limb that was suitable for her, and she engaged with physiotherapy. She explained that it was like night and day, the difference between the prosthetic arrangements. This was a woman who had spent 2 years basically in her wheelchair, and that's how she thought she was going to be for the future. The last time I spoke to her was just a couple of weeks ago, and we were on the phone for about 30 minutes. For the duration of that call, she was standing unaided. And while it might not seem like very much, the sheer joy in her voice was fantastic. So the importance of private prosthetic provision in Scotland cannot be overstated. The accessibility for our clients, but it's really quite obvious here. There's reduced travel cost and there's reduced cost overall. It is not just where we're involved of going, okay, well, we've got the prosthetic expert, we've got the report, this is what the client's going to have. They need to live with this for the rest of their life. They need to be able to attend their appointments. They need to be able to engage with physiotherapists for a long time after we've moved on from their case. So there's decreased costs for the duration there. But they're also far more likely to engage with rehab if it's on their doorstep. For a long time, we used to have to send clients down south and say, right, here's a 2-week rehab program, but they're away from family. They could engage with it when they were there, but they'd go back and revert back to their normal life because there was a disengagement between what rehab was and what their life was. But being able to have it accessible in their vicinity, whether it's taking them out mountain biking, whether it's walking to the shops, whatever it might be for them, means that they're going to be far more likely to engage in the short, medium, and longer term. From the solicitor's perspective, it is important that you take your client on the journey of the civil litigation. At the end of the day, they're going to have to attend multiple appointments with experts, with you, and with advocates. So they need to understand why these appointments are happening and what the end goal is going to be. Keep in mind what their goals are and what they want to achieve as well. You can then work towards those goals together. At the end of the day, you need to keep in mind what you will be able to recover and what evidence you require to present that to the defenders and even potentially to the court. It is using the foundation of those early statements, those services statements, video footage, that you can then clearly demonstrate why a particular prosthetic arrangement is suitable and should be funded. And I will leave you with the age-old saying, fail to prepare, prepare to fail. There is a reason that as solicitors you need to prepare the case and consider every eventuality, consider every head of claim, because it's you that is going to have to be able to then instruct the relevant experts, instruct counsel, and prepare your case for litigation. Thank you very much.